So yeah, this is my talk. Everything I ever needed to know about web development, I learned from my Twitter timeline. Okay, so before we start, just a little bit about me. My name is Colin DeCarlo. I'm a software developer just like you. I work with PHP and JavaScript, probably just like you. And I'm also a local meetup organizer, hopefully just like you. I work for Vehicle. Vehicle is a software consultancy. We're based out of Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. We help companies build really great applications that are backed by Laravel. Okay, and so if you want to learn more about the company, you can check us out. They're actually just right down here at the front, so thanks. Hi, guys. We got a booth just right outside the doors. You can check us out there, too. Okay, so we don't got a lot of time, so let's just jump right into it. 6 million years ago, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and I was heading off to university to start my computer science education, this was basically how you did it at that point, right? So a bunch of people just filed into an auditorium. Somebody sat up front and they said, here's some information, right? And they just spouted information. And it was my job to kind of soak up that information like a sponge. And I was actually kind of like this guy. Sorry if I'm running. You see this guy, he's just like questioning everything that he's ever done in his life, right? Like, what got me to this position? Thankfully, though, that's not the case anymore, right? We don't actually have to do that. We don't have to stand there and just soak up information. Now we've got online resources, right, that we can use to customize our education, right? And we can tailor our education to exactly what we want to do. You don't want to have to learn about compilers if all you want to do is do some web development, right? What this is actually saying, though, is that the internet has fundamentally changed the way we access information today. Okay? It's changed us from being passive participants in our education, and it's turned us into active facilitators of our education. Okay? So this comes with a lot of benefits, like I said. We can customize the information that we're accepting, but it also comes with some costs, right? Now we have to be a little bit more critical of the information that we get, right? We have to be able to say, hey, is this information that's being presented to me, is this something I can trust? Is it something I'm going to internalize and carry with me? Because you can't believe everything that you read online. I'm not sure if you've learned that or not, but everything that you see on Twitter isn't always the truth, and it's not always the best thing for you. But you can use Twitter to help with your education, okay? Now, over the course of the years, a bit of a phenomenon in our community has actually arisen, right? It's given us a little bit of help with this critical eye that we've got, and that's the fire tweet. Okay? So if you're not familiar with what the fire tweet actually is, it's this. This is actually the very first fire tweet. It came out by Wes Boss, and it looks like this. Okay? So it has a fire emoji. It's got a tip, right? And then it generally has like an example screenshot to tell you, give you a little bit more context about what they're talking about. And then so a bunch of people in our community saw this, they globbed onto this idea, and they started using it. And they started sending out all sorts of tweets using this pattern. This is my fire tweet. This is information you can trust. Believe me, buy my stuff. All that sort of thing, right? And so what I thought would be pretty fun and pretty cool was if I collected a bunch of these tweets, right? And I would categorize them, I would see what they're talking about and see if I can pull any themes out of these tweets. So I did that. I took about 300 or 400 of these fire tweets, more like 200, sorry, I'm trying to exaggerate. And I was able to pull a theme out of it. And one of the themes that I want to talk about today is this idea of declarative programming, okay? So what is declarative programming, right? A lot of the time, declarative programming is described as what it's not, okay? So it's not how something is done, that's imperative, right? What declarative programming actually talks about is what is being done, okay? So if we're talking about what is being done and not talking about how is being done, I was thinking, what is it that makes me think of how, right? And if I want to approach a more declarative programming style, what can I do to do that? So when I think of how, I think of if conditions. If this, then that, else do this. So if I want a more declarative programming style, I might want to start thinking about removing branching logic from my code, okay? So I want to be careful about what I'm saying here, okay? And I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I'm not saying that ifs are considered harmful. It's definitely not what I'm saying right now. I'm not saying I want to eradicate if statements at all costs. That's definitely not it, right? What I am saying to you, though, is smell your if statements, right? Just give them a whiff. See if they smell okay, right? Because we need if statements. So if they smell good, keep them, right? But if they smell a little off, then maybe there's another way that we could write this to get the same behavior in a more declarative fashion. So here's an example that I'm talking about. This is, well, don't read it, just look at it, okay? This is an excerpt from a chunk of code, a coding kata called the Gilded Rose. Take a look at the shape here, right? It goes in, and then it comes out. This actual chunk of code here, this has 5 layers of nesting, right? And so what that 5 layers is actually meaning is it's confusing, it's complex, it's cluttered, it's gross, it's just plain fugly, right? And so this type of programming where we have all this deep indentation, that's what I like to call cowhead programming, because it goes out and it comes in, right? Now with a little bit of effort and some refactoring, we can take this code and we can turn it into this, right? Again, don't read it, just look at the shape of it, right? There's no indentation here, right? It just goes straight down. We've removed all of the branching logic. This is something that I like to call, and I'm hoping to coin today, and you use it, pughead programming. Because it goes straight down, right? All right. So where am I going with all this, right? I've talked about removing branching logic, declarative programming, Twitter, all those sorts of things, right? Let's tie it together. So let's talk about our scenario. This is what I like to do in my talks. I like to present a scenario. So we've got a CMS, right? And that CMS has articles. It's got titles and content. And what I was thinking what we could do is we could use Twitter to help refactor a controller action in our code, okay? So this is the controller action for updating an article, right? So if we're going to give it the pughead programming test, it does pretty good, right? It goes straight down. There's one layer of nesting. It doesn't really have a lot of deep nesting, so that's good. But there are a number of if statements here, right? So we've got one here, 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 and here. And I think all of those if statements deserve a whiff, right? So let's take a closer look. This chunk of code here, right? This is more dealing with how we're going to be finding the article in our database. This chunk of code here, this says how we're going to be authorizing the update. This here, this says how we're going to be getting the updated attributes. And the only chunk of code here that actually deals with what we're talking about is right here. Of course, that's what is being done. That's updating the article, right? So about 80% of the code in this controller action deals with how, right? None of it deals with the what. So the promise of frameworks is it takes care of 80% of the work so we can focus on the 20% that makes our application special, right? So let's use the framework to refactor this controller to get down to those 2 lines, right? We can do it because I've got this talk prepared and I know that we can get to that, all right? So let's use the framework and let's use our hot tweets that we get in Twitter to do that work, okay? So the first thing that I want to talk about is this chunk of code here where we're getting the updated attributes, all right? So you can see we get the updated attributes, we're initializing it to an empty array, and then we're stepping through the request, seeing if it has things that we're interested in, right? Because we don't want null values. We don't want to be removing anything in the update. So Adam had a tweet from 2017 that said, request intersect is an awesome way to simplify partial model updates. So the example that he gives here is we've got a patch coming in to I think to a record that has a title and a label. And in the controller, though, we're looking for titles, artists, years, and labels, right? And so instead of going through here and saying, does it have this, does it have that, we can just use request intersect. Give me the title, the artist, the year, and the label if it's there in the request. Now, you will notice that this was in 2017. That was Laravel 5.3, okay? And a lot has changed in the framework since 5.3, and request intersect is actually not there anymore. But, like all things that have left us, a little bit too early in it, we can keep the spirit alive, and we can use the tools that we have today to actually accomplish the same thing, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to add some validation, all right? And the validation that we're going to add is going to use 2 of the validation rules that I love to use together, okay? That's sometimes and required, okay? So if you're not familiar with sometimes says this attribute could be in the request, it might not be. Okay? And required, of course, says this has to have a value. It can't be null. So when we say it's sometimes required, we're saying it could be in the request. If it's not, no big deal. But if it is, it better have a value. Okay? Now, because of that, we don't have to initialize updated attributes to an empty array. We can jump right to it. And we can just say, give me only the title and the content out of the request. Now that we've got that, we don't actually have to step through the request and pull out the title and the content. So that code goes away, and our controller gets smaller, right? And it's time to celebrate. So I like to celebrate. I celebrate big wins. I celebrate small wins. I like to have a good time at work. All right. So moving on, though, let's talk about this chunk of code here. Again, this was how we get the article out of the database. Okay? This time, Taylor comes to us and he says, model route binding is a top 5 Laravel feature and you should use it. Now, he wrote the framework, so I have a tendency to believe him, even though it's not a fire tweet. So let's do that, all right? So we're going to start in our routes file. So this post route, instead of accepting the ID, what we're going to do is we're going to accept the entire article. So we're going to change our route parameter over to that article, okay? Now, in the controller, instead of having the ID being passed into our controller action, we're going to type hint the article, and that's going to give us our implicit route model binding. Now the article is going to come right into our controller, so we don't actually have to find it into the database, or find it and pull it out of the database. So that code goes away, and again, the controller action is a lot smaller, and it's time to feel like a firework. All right. Now, we're almost there. The code's bigger because there's not as much there, so that's good. Let's deal with this. This is the authorization logic, okay? So what we're actually saying here is if the ID of the authenticated user isn't the author ID on the article, then get rid of it. You know, you're not allowed to do this. So Taylor says, one thing I like to do to keep controllers lean and clean is offload grunt validation and helper work into a form request. All right? So let's do that. Let's create a form request. We're going to use Artisan to do that. We're going to make an update article request. And we're going to be dealing with the authorized part of our request. So by default, we deny, right? That's a pretty good default, but we do want people to be able to use this route. So we're going to get rid of that return false, okay? And what we're going to do is we're pretty much going to copy and paste the code from our controller into here with one important distinction. In the controller, what we were saying is if the user isn't allowed to do this, we're going to abort, right? In here, we're answering the question, is the person allowed to make this request? So we're actually looking for equality here instead of inequality. So we're saying if the user ID is the author ID, then they're okay to do that. Back to our controller now, we have to update the method declaration again. This time we're going to be injecting the update article request. Because we're injecting that request, we actually don't have to use the request helper anymore. So we can just replace that with the request that's being injected, and now we can deal with the authorization. Again, the authorization is going to happen when the request is actually dealt with, and so that just goes away, and our controller action just got that much smaller, and again, time to celebrate. But, as you can probably tell, something's not quite right, okay? So, what is it? It's here in our article request, okay? So take a look at this. The update article request, basically what we're answering again is can the person make this request, right? But if we look at this condition here, what we're actually saying is kind of like, is the person, the authenticated user, allowed to update the article, right? So that's not the responsibility of this update article request. That's the responsibility of a policy. Is the person allowed to make this action? So let's move that into a policy, okay? Now that it's here in a policy, we've got an update. We're being passed in the user and the article, and we can just take the code from our authorize function and put it in here, and it's in the right spot. But again, look at this. User ID equals author ID, okay? That's how, right? That's how we're making this equality decision, right? But we can use the framework to say what we want. What we're actually saying is the user the article's author, right? So we can use the is method that's actually on our model to say, hey, is the user the article's author? That's a lot more declarative. That talks about what we're doing as opposed to how we're doing it. Now in our authorize method, this code is gone, and we can just replace it with can. Can the user update the article? If they can, then they're allowed to make the request. Otherwise, they can't. right? Again, a lot more declarative, focuses on what we're doing and not how we're doing it. And it's time to celebrate. All right. Just keep trucking along a bit. All right, so we got, let's deal with the validation right now, okay? So again, back to that tweet, Taylor says he likes to offload the validation onto the update article, or up onto form requests as well. So let's do that, okay? This time we're going to be dealing with rules. So we're going to copy and paste the code from our controller and just paste it in here. Now the validation is going to happen when the article is actually, when the request is resolved, okay? And because of that, we can get rid of this code. And now we're down to 3 lines, okay? Now, I said I wanted to get to 2 lines, okay? So let's get there. You see this, where we've got the request only reaching in for the title and the content? I think the controller knows too much about the request at this point, right? And there's a better way, a more declarative way of saying what we actually want to get out of here, right? So we're pulling the title and the content out. What if that changes? What if there's more attributes that we want to get? Now we can just say to the request, give me the validated data, and I'm going to make that my updated attributes, okay? Again, more declarative. Let's look at update attributes here, okay? That's being assigned once and used once. So we can use a refactoring here called inline temporary variable. So we can just take that, get rid of updated attributes in the update call, and use request validated on its own. And now we don't need updated attributes. That goes away, and we've got 2 lines, right? So this, yeah. I only have 14 more minutes, so please stop clapping. But yeah, take a look at what we've done here, right? What we've done is we've gone from a controller that looks like this, right? We had to wade through all of this how, okay? And we turned it into this that focuses just on what's actually being done, okay? Now you can clap, all right? So we've got a problem though. We've got these things called stakeholders, right? And they want the application to do things, and sometimes different things than what it did before. So they have a feature request, right? Now what they want to deal with is they want administrators to be able to edit articles as well, not just the article's author, okay? So we're talking about who was allowed to perform this action. So that belongs in our article policy, right? We're going to be doing more work here, so we need more space. We can keep this chunk of code here where we say if the user is the article's author, and we can just move it up into a condition. We can just short circuit the method here, return true if that's the case, and we're done. If it's not the case, though, now we have to do that extra work and check to see if this person is an administrator. So what we can do here is we can grab it, and we can say, of the user's roles, is the administrator role in there, right? Again, when we're looking at this, this is how, right? This is how we're making that decision, right? There might be a better way that we can say what we want to say, right? So what I think at this point is we can extract this into a method that belongs on the user, and we can just call it has role. So when we're reading it, we say, if the user has the administrator role, then they're okay to do that, right? Again, more declarative, less about how we're doing it, more about what we're doing. All right. So again, this is how, right? How the decision is being made, okay? And it's actually an or statement, right? If we look at it, right? If the user is the author, or if they have an administrator role, right? And so it's an if condition, we should smell it. We should think, is there a way that we can write this in a different way that allows us to remove that condition, right? So Caleb this time has a tip for us. He says we can clean up our or statements with JavaScript array includes. And we're not writing JavaScript, we're writing PHP, so we can use the collection contains, right? But what he's actually saying here is we're looking at this event, and we're saying if the event is click, or if it's submit, or if it's key down, then we're going to do something. So we're looking at this chunk here from the perspective of the event. But if we change the perspective and we say, these are the events that I'm interested in, does the event that I have, is it included in that set, then I'm going to do that, okay? So we can do something similar in our own code, right? So instead of looking at it from the user's perspective, we can think about who can edit this article. So we do know that administrators can edit the article, all of them, doesn't matter. And we also have this other group called writers. Now, not all of the writers can update the article, just the author, right? Now, if we remove these groups altogether and we create a new group out of it, what we've got here is the article's editors, right? So we've created this new idea on the article called editors. We want to be able to say, of the article's editors, is the user one of these? So we can do that with an accessor in our article model. So we can create a function called getEditorsAttribute, and that can be composed of all of the administrators plus our author. Now in our policy, we can get rid of this or condition here, and we can replace it with the article's editors contains the user. We're looking at it from the perspective of the article. We're in the article policy. Let's treat it like, well, let's look at the article instead, right? Let's celebrate, because the code is a lot more declarative, right? All right. All right. One more feature request to get through, okay? This one's a bit of a doozy, though, right? So we've got articles have hero images, all right? So what they want is people to be able to upload images that we can have at the top of our article to get people interested in it. So we're going to be dealing with file uploads, and we're not going to be putting those files on the server that they're being uploaded to. We're going to send them up to S3, right? Now, I wrote this slide deck at, well, before Vapor existed, and so we're going to have to do this the old way, right, as opposed to just using Vapor's nice, cool way of dealing with S3. So let's make a new controller, right, because it's a new resource. It's a hero image. And there's a lot of code that we're going to have to deal with, right? So the first thing we're going to do is pull the hero out of the request, right? Now, we can't just update the article with the hero image. We're not saving the hero image in the database, right? What we're going to be saving is the hero's URL, right, to S3. So that's what we're actually going to be updating our article with. Now, it can't always be null because we do want heroes' images to exist on our articles, right? So we're going to have to do some work if we actually have a hero here, okay? I'm saying hero a lot. What we're going to do is we're going to generate a name for our hero using an invocable class, okay? So that's going to give us a name. Now that we have the name, we can put it in S3. So we're going to be using the storeAs method on hero to put it up there, all right? So again, a lot of code to deal with here, right? How do we know what works? Well, we've got tests. Don't read them, just know that they exist, okay? So we know that one can be added, we know that one can be removed, and we know that they pass, all right? So the good thing about this of having passing tests is we're covered to refactor. We can refactor as much as we want without making any mistakes. Or we can make mistakes, but at least we're covered. So let's get rid of this if, right? It smells bad and I don't want it. So Taylor has another tweet for us. He says that we can use optional to deal with situations like this. So what he's talking about here is down in this finally block. We're wrapping this lock with an optional. We're creating an optional object with it, okay? And what optional does is it will wrap an object, or it can wrap null, right? If it wraps an object that actually has methods on it, all the calls to that optional object will be delegated down to the object that it's wrapping. If it's wrapping null, however, what it'll do is it'll just eat up all of those calls and just return null as though it was a no-op. So it's safe to actually use, even if it's not something. No more call method on null, right? With using optional for that. So if we go to our controller and we think what could be null in our request, it's the hero image, right? So we can wrap that with optional. Now it's always going to be there, right? It's always going to be something, so we don't have to check if it's there. We can get rid of that condition and just bring our code back, and now we've got our pug head. You see how here we are initializing hero URL to null, and then we're setting it down in the hero store as. We don't need to do that anymore, right? So we can get rid of that code, and now our controller is a lot smaller, all right? Well, it's a little bit smaller. It's still pretty ugly. It still deals with a lot of how something is happening, right? So what I want to do now is I want to deal with this chunk of code in the middle where we're generating the hero name and then grabbing a URL and then saving it into our database. That's a lot of how, right? And that code doesn't belong on our controller. So Adam has a tweet here that says we can use eloquent mutators to update a different column in our model, right? So what does that look like? You can see here he's got a product model, right? And he's got a mutator on here called setPriceInDollars_attribute. And it's not setting the price in dollars on the actual model. It's setting another column called price, right? But in his controller, he's passing in price in dollars, right? And we can do the same thing with the hero, okay? So let's add a mutator to our article model again. And it's going to be called setHeroAttribute. we can take the code that's from the controller and we can pretty much paste it in here as is. There's a few little changes. We're setting the attribute as opposed to updating it. But that's it. Now, the code goes away. I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. And the controller is a lot smaller now, right? And it's a lot more declarative, too. Instead of the hero URL that we're actually updating the article with, we're updating the article with the actual hero. And it's time to celebrate. Okay, earlier in the test, in the talk, I said you didn't have to read the test, right? Well, that was then, this is now. There's a little bit of jank in here, right? There's a lot of code in here too, but it's separated. It's a well-behaved test, okay? So we've got arrange, we've got act, and we've got assert. And our jank exists in our arranged phase here. You see this chunk of code up here? Generate hero name test name equals something.jpg. Why do I have code that has the word test in it? You know, something's not quite right here, and I want to see what's going on here. So if we jump into that class and we look at generate hero name, there's a chunk of code here that says if the environment is testing, just return that test name. Okay? So I can see all your reactions, and you're right. This is pretty horrific. This is not okay, right? This is not okay because this means that we can't test this code in the bottom here that runs in production, right? The only time that actually runs is in production. The only time that we're actually going to see if there's a problem with this code is in production, right? That's not good, right? We need to be able to test our code. So we need to be able to get rid of this check here to say if the environment is testing, okay? This time, Dave Hempel has something for us. He says, hey, are you testing simple S3 uploads with randomized file names? Pretty convenient. Yes, we are. We can use storage fake and real-time facades, right? So what he's doing here, he's got ID generator, right? And that's a real class in his application. But in his test, he's treating it as though it was a facade, and he's replacing it with a mock. Okay, so that's happening right here. So we can do pretty much the same thing. And that's, again, using real-time facades. Now, I don't want to explain how real-time facades actually work, okay? And that's partially because I don't know how. Real-time facades are that one piece of Laravel that I like to think is just magic, okay? I like using it, I like knowing it's there, but I don't want to think about how it's actually doing it. It's just magic, okay? So let's do that. What we're going to do is we need to make this a real-time facade. So first thing we have to do is we have to change the use statement. So instead of the app generate hero name, we're going to be using facades app generate hero name, and this is the clue to Laravel to say this is a real-time facade. Now that we've got that, we can just treat it like it was a facade and mock it out ourselves. So now we can say it should receive for article and return something.jpg, okay? That means in our class now, we can finally get rid of this code here that checks the environment. It's gone. Also, the test name is gone. We don't have any more code that has the word test in it, which is great. And we've got a lot less, well, we've got more room now, actually. And that's good because now we can add the for article method that we were going to be saying that we're going to be calling in our test, okay? How do we use this in our model, though, okay? So in our model, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to, instead of having the app generate hero name, we're going to use its real-time facade. Now, instead of instantiating the generate hero name, we can get rid of that, and we can just use the facade directly with the for article method that we created. Now that that's there, everything's just going to work. It's all wired up, and that's it. Again, I can't really explain it. It's just magic. All right? Okay. And that's it, actually. That's my talk today. So thank you very much. Whew. All right, right on time.